So before we begin, who are we? We are Halton Food Gardens. So we're a proud program of Halton Environmental Network. The mission of Halton Food is to educate residents about sustainable food production and promote access to local, healthy, culturally relevant food through environmentally sustainable community gardening, urban farming, and school gardens. If you need more information about us, please contact us at www.haltonfood.ca. Check us out on social media, Instagram at halton.food, Facebook and Twitter, our handle is at Halton Food. And again, check us out on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Our handle is at halton.food, Halton Food, and at Halton Food. So feel free to check us out. And if we don't answer any of your questions as succinctly as you would like, please feel free to contact us on any of those channels. Right, so I'm going to introduce my coworker, Allison. She's going to present the first part of this conversation about gardening.
Thank you so much, Helen. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my shabby chic greenhouse. So I live along the Niagara Escarpment, just on the other side of Waterdown. But what I do is I oversee the coordination of the Burlington community gardens that we have with Halton Region, and the community garden behind St. Christopher's Anglican Church. Sorry, I have a dog here as well. Gimli, come on. Sorry, the joys of working at home, right? So I'm going to talk just a brief bit about some things that we can do in the garden today, because it is a beautiful, absolutely gorgeous and amazing sunny day outside. And whether you have a backyard, a community allotment that you can do some of your growing in, or a balcony, there are a ton of things that you can get accomplished to get outside, get some vitamin D, and get you prepped for the growing season ahead. It has been a very cool and unusual spring. Temperatures have been pretty low. Typically in this area, it's anywhere from April 20th to May 28th, the last frost date. So even though it's felt pretty cool, we're pretty on track. And this week you'll notice that the nighttime temperatures are going up. I believe it's going to be about 10 degrees Friday evening. So just in time for May 24th, which is kind of that universal go ahead and plant those tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and basil in southern Ontario. I would still suggest protecting those type of plants at nighttime, because a lot of our growers have been, you know, behind schedule with everything that's been happening with COVID. Not as many people working in the greenhouses or even the shops to process orders. So things have been a little bit slower. They may or they may not have had time to harden off their crops. So when you say harden off, it means it's going outside for a couple hours each day during the day, from the greenhouse to outside, and acclimatizing itself. So in a greenhouse, in mine here, it's 26 degrees Celsius. It is very warm. So the plants are nice and cozy. Whereas outside, the temperature is only about 15 degrees Celsius. If I were to take my tomatoes and just put them in the garden straight from the greenhouse, guarantee I will lose them. So we put them out for a couple hours, bring them back and forth, and eventually you can leave them outside. If you don't have the option of moving things back and forth, you can protect some of those garden plants by using plastic cloches. So traditionally it's a glass bell that you would put over top of vegetables in the evening time, and it's gonna like trap in all the heat and the moisture. And then you take it off during the day so you can get some fresh air circulation, the leaves can dry off, and then you don't get any plant diseases. Nowadays you can use plastic, so an old pop bottle, like one of those 2 liters, just cut off the bottom, leaving the top and the lid on it. So you can kind of put that on and off. Another thing you can use, I happen to do a lot of canning, that sort of stuff. So I have lots of really large mason jars available. So you can use these. You're going to put them over top of your plants. This about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 o'clock. You don't want it to get too hot in there, too hot, and then your plants are going to wilt and die. But making sure that you're at least trapping some heat and moisture for the nighttime. So what else can we do in the garden in May? Well, it's weeding time. There are a ton of weeds, including a lot of invasive species like garlic mustard that are very happy, but we don't want them in our gardens because they spread like crazy and they prevent a lot of our native species from, blooming and growing, but then they're also going to take all the nutrients out of the soil for things such as our vegetables that we're planting. You want to spend some time and deadhead spring flowering perennials. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, as well as dividing different spring flowering perennials. Now, a lot of the time, people think about vegetable gardening. It's like, well, what perennials can I even have in the garden that would be vegetables? Well, this lovely creature here, chives, the one we all love to hate. They can move very, very quickly if not kept in check in our gardens. So this is something that we're going to talk about deadheading and dividing. Another thing you can do in the springtime is prune your lavender when the leaf buds break. You're going to prune any spring flowering shrubs immediately blooming. You're going to remove unwanted perennial seedlings. We don't want to have any competition in the garden. Watching for pests such as aphids, because this weather, things are going to take off really quickly. One day you might see 1 or 2 aphids, and 2 days later you can see hundreds of them, especially on our brassicas. So that's going to be the kale, or broccoli, cauliflower. We also want to prepare our vegetable gardens, and like I mentioned, we're going to start planting out our hot climate crops after the May 2-4 weekend. So those are our tomatoes, our cucumbers, our squash, and our melons. So let's talk a little bit about flowering perennials. Essentially, it's off with their heads. So removing the spent blossoms is going to make your garden pretty tidy, and it's also going to refresh the appearance of things. It's going to help control seed dispersal, because if there's no flower, that flower can't be pollinated and seeds can't be created. But what we want to do is we want to redirect the plant's energy from seed production more into the roots and then to the vegetative growth. And really, this can be done at any time throughout the season as long as you're starting to see flowers come up. But now is a great time to do it because you can get ahead of everything. So, with our chives, essentially what you want to do is just go along and take off the tops. Now, you don't need to throw these out. You can use these in salads. This one here, which is a flower that hasn't opened up yet, I've sauteed it in a little bit of olive oil, put it into stir fry. You can also pickle it. So if you have any pickles that you're planning on doing, you can dry them, pickle them with the actual flower heads. You can take these apart and you can add them to different salads. Another thing I like to do with the chive heads is to make a vinaigrette to add to salad dressings. So yeah, it's pretty easy. You're just gonna go along the top and it's off with their heads. It's also a lot of fun. So if you have any young people in your house, or you're just a really big kid who loves to garden like me, you can just go through and pull all these heads off your chives. Okay. So other than our chives, can you guys think of any other perennial plants you might have in your garden you might want to deadhead? If you have any ideas, feel free to drop them into the chat. So lots of flowers, obviously. Horseradish, if anybody grows that in their garden, you want to do that. But one of the more kind of famous perennials that we deadhead is going to be garlic. So once the scapes come up, so it's going to grow up straight and then it's going to start curling around. Eventually it will bloom. But again, we want to take away that bloom and get all the energy to go down into the bulb, into the root system, so we can have really large garlic bulbs. So I do have a list here of flowering plants in your garden that work really well with any of our vegetables. And this will be posted on our website at haltonfood.ca, and then the whole presentation on YouTube. So then you can also go back and refer to this list. There is a quick question that came through. How do you make the vinaigrette? Pretty straightforward. I use some apple cider vinegar, and then I'll just take a handful of either the flowers or the buds, and I'll use a small jar. You can use a mason jar. I have a lot of these bottles I picked up at IKEA kind of eons ago. So I would fill it about this high with the vinegar, and then it's gonna be terrible tasting water later. And then you would just drop these in. And you would want to use up to about kind of half a cup. Then you're gonna put the lid on, and vinegar is a fantastic preservative. And in about a week, you will have vinaigrette. It will be fairly garlicky, so you might need to add a little bit of honey to it. You don't need to strain out those buds, but you can. You'll also notice that it turns a very beautiful pink color. So, okay, I'm not gonna be drinking that for the rest of this presentation. So dividing perennials. Let's talk about this. So a lot of the times I divide my herbs in the springtime that overwinter. So my thyme, my sage, oregano, chives, because chives honestly will get crazy out of control. And the other one that gets out of control fairly quickly when you have soil that's more loam or sandy loam are the mints. So usually we like to say put them in a pot so they can be root bound and they can't grow all over the place. But if you don't like to grow in pots, that's completely fine. I put everything in the garden. And just remember that when you're dividing, you do need to be aware of the time of year. So if you have a perennial plant that flowers between kind of, you know, that April and mid-June, then you actually want to be dividing it in the early fall. So either, you know, the fall that's coming up, or you would have done it last year. And then perennials that are flowering kind of mid-June and beyond, the summertime, you can divide those in the spring. And doing this is going to allow the plant to have a good amount of growth either in the springtime. So if we're dividing in the fall, it's going to have good growth in the springtime, and you're not disturbing the roots so much that the plant will go into shock. So for mints specifically, I do that in the autumn just because it takes a lot of time to go through mints. And I actually use the flowers in a couple things, such as for making teas. But honestly, a mint will grow back pretty much all the time. So you don't have to worry too much about the timing of that. But things such as the lavender, you know, they're going to be blooming in the summertime, so you want to divide those in the spring. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the actual garden now. So what is ready? What can we harvest right now? The temperatures are great for lettuces, spinach. Your pea shoots would have come up, not quite ready to flower, but that's okay. Mache, which is a very cold hardy, it's like a lettuce, but a different plant family. Rapini, which is a type of broccoli, and Swiss chard. So if you had planted in early April or even kind of March, then they'll be ready now. You can also plant all of these right now for harvesting at the end of June. Other things that you want to be planting now are going to be your potatoes. So they do like cooler weather. We could have gotten away with planting them about 2 weeks ago. Any other cool climate crops? But right now we're going to be looking at pumpkins and squashes, either by transplant or by direct seed. But again, pay attention to those frost dates. if you notice by just like looking at the Weather Channel every day, all of a sudden the temperature is going below 5 degrees at nighttime, make sure that you're going to be covering your plants that are outside, because they're going to be very susceptible to frost damage. And the way you can usually tell that there's frost damage is if you have a really nice green leaf and about a week later that you're seeing purple on the margins. That purple is a good indication that there's frost damage. So I've dropped in a couple of links on the slide. You'll notice that I've got Burlington, Oakville, Milton, Georgetown. So this is going to take you to the Good Old Farmer's Almanac website, where they keep track of all those historic frost dates. And then it'll also bring up a list of all the different crops that you could be planting right now, and the ideal temperatures for planting and for harvesting, that sort of thing. So yeah, we just need to keep in mind that tomatoes, cucumbers, and basils, we got to wait until May 2-4, just a little bit longer so the soil has a good amount of time to heat up. So this is where we are going to open up all the chat for any questions that you guys have. I'll be available, as well as Helen, to answer your questions. So yeah, if you have questions, just drop them down into the chat box there.
I'm going to get things started for you, Allison. I received a question about planting potatoes.
Okay.
Can I plant the potatoes that I found in my cupboard? And if so, how do I do it?
Absolutely. I just happen to have some potatoes here. This wasn't planned. So these were potatoes that I had found in my cupboard. Usually, they roll to the very back of the cupboard under the sink, and you completely forget about them. And then they start to sprout. So these have just been sitting in a really small tray. All the black plastic is unfortunately not recyclable in Hamilton where I live. So I reuse it for all my planting. I don't put any holes in the bottom, so that way I can keep it on my kitchen counter. I just monitor and make sure that the soil is nice and moist. So what I've done is I've actually put them on the surface of the soil, and then, just gently squish them down. I'm gonna pull one out here. So this is about, I'd say, 2.5 weeks of growth. This has been sitting in my greenhouse that has not heated, so it gets pretty cool at nighttime, but they're happy. So you can see that there's a sprout. So when you're choosing the potatoes that have, kind of disappeared, make sure you have ones that have 1 or 2 eyes. So that's where the sprouts are going to come from. And if you've got a little bit of green on the leaf, that's even better. You don't want to be choosing old potatoes that are mushy, that smell weird, or they look like they have like a mold on them. Because if you decide to plant that in your garden, then you're going to be spreading some disease around. So from here, I can do some raised bed gardening. A lot of people use the buckets. I usually put potatoes into the ground because I'm fortunate to have a lot of space, but I can just take this whole thing, drop it into the soil about 6 inches down, cover it up, and then I leave it. I let it kind of grow at its own pace, making sure that the soil is moist. I don't want the soil to be so wet that when you squeeze it, water is dripping. What we want is squeeze, it holds its form, but there's no dripping water. But yeah, any potatoes in your cupboards are gonna work. So, ooh, this is fun. There is the root growth underneath. So nice white roots. If any of your roots are yellow and brown, that means there's being too much moisture and you're starting to get rot. Yeah, these are really nice and white. I have some here. There's a really small one that's taken off all these shoots. So this is telling me that I definitely need to get this into a planter, a box, or into the soil. And I could harvest some new potatoes probably the end of June. And for harvesting, you want to wait until the leaves completely die back. Because for storage purposes, we want the plant to send as much energy as possible into these tiny tubers so they get nice and large. And for storage, you want to make sure that you put them back in the back of your cupboard, but essentially somewhere where it's dry but not damp and nice and dark.
Okay, we have a question about container gardening. So that one's great. Container gardening, you can control the soil, you can move the pots around to be in the sun or out of the sun, depending on what you're growing. A couple of tips to keep in mind is keep it in proportion to the container. So you don't want to be planting big long carrots and your container is only 6 inches deep, right? That's not going to work. So bigger containers for the bigger vegetables. So anything that's going to go down into the soil, like your carrots, or anything that's going to grow up quite a few feet, like tomatoes, you need that soil to have the nutrients for your plants. You need it a little bit bigger for that. And just look for your dwarf varieties. So, I mean, you're not going to grow probably watermelon coming out of a container, but I do see the next question is about cucamelons. So maybe you could grow that. It's not quite watermelons, but but you know, just look for dwarf varieties, different varieties that you can grow. Usually they're called patio sized. That's what you're looking for. So I don't know if you have any specific questions about containers, but almost everything can be grown in a container unless it's a big spreading rambling pumpkin patch, right? So you don't want to be doing that, but you can certainly grow carrots, lettuce, spinach, kale, tomatoes, peppers, beets, radishes, like the list goes on and on and on. So it's container gardening is absolutely great for that. So if you have any,
I've mentioned carrots a couple of times. These are carrots growing just in a tray. Here's the tray. I planted these. Let's see. On April 5th. So a little bit slower than I would have liked. But these are a dwarf variety called Paris Market Atlas. I had picked the seeds up at William Dam. I don't know if William Dam still has seeds available. I know they've been pretty kind of far behind on their orders because gardening is super popular this year. Yay! But the actual carrots will only grow to be the size of a radish. So radishes are another good kind of root vegetable, and some beets to put into containers. But again, it's only going to grow about that big, so there's going to be enough space with a container like this.
and as our other co-worker Andrea pointed out, containers do dry out a lot quicker than say a raised bed or an in-ground planting. So you got to check the moisture levels pretty much every day, especially when we started getting into July and August. And you should add something like vermiculite or perlite to keep that moisture in the soil and not leaching right through. Because the wind is going to dry it out and the sun's going to dry it out, and clay pots tend to dry out a lot faster. Sorry, clay pots dry out a lot faster than if it was made out of ceramic or wood. So just to keep an eye on them pretty much every day. So the next question I'll pass back to you, Allison, and it is, sure. I am planting cucamelons for the very first time and will be doing that in a square-foot garden. Do you have any suggestions regarding the number of seeds that should be planted? And good for you, because I actually planted these last year and they were a lot of fun. So
they are so much fun. So if you can imagine watermelons that are this big, that taste like cucumbers. Yeah, they're also called mouse melons. Or the Mexican sour gherkin. There's a whole different number of names for them. Whatever you do, make sure you have a trellis for them, because you could plant one seed in a square foot and it's going to go all over the place. I would recommend 4 within 1 square foot, and you can put a pretty tall bean trellis that's 2, 3, if you're doing regular like compost addition fertilizer 4 feet tall, they're, yeah, I know. They're pretty big, but you're also going to get a lot out of such a small crop. Yeah, harvesting will kind of start the end of July and it can go all the way through to September. I've had some cucamelons also producing fruit at the end of September and early October, but the moment frost comes, it's going to completely wipe it out. For preserving them, I've had pickled cucamelons. They tend to go a little bit soggy, not like our actual cucumbers that can stay nice and crisp. So I would recommend taking full advantage of the fresh vegetable. Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't sound as pleasant.
No, I like trying lots of different foods and different ways of processing. So I was at a really cool farmer's market a couple of years ago. I was like, oh yeah, sure. But it didn't kind of appeal to my palate. But if you try pickling cucamelons and they turn out like nice and firm and crispy, send me the recipe because I would like to know how that can be achieved.
And when I teach people how to garden, so just to add on to Allison, I usually put 2 seeds in every hole, and then I will take the weaker one out. And that's just in case one doesn't germinate. So you've got the plants that you do want. Next question. This is the first year I got a community plot. Oh, good for you. So how do I condition the soil because you're not sure what was planted last year? And that is a very good point. So a lot of plants in the tomato, pepper, and potato family, Solanaceae, if I pronounce that correctly, which I usually don't, they carry a lot of diseases. So yes, you don't want to be planting tomatoes where you had potatoes. You don't want to keep planting tomatoes in the same spot year after year after year. They are susceptible to something that's called blight. I'm sure we've all heard of the great Irish potato famine. That was blight. So we don't want to be doing that to our own plants. But since you don't know what was planted there, good point. You want to add lots of good quality compost and soil. It is unfortunately going to be, I mean, maybe Allison can add to this, but it is going to be a bit of a guessing game where you're going to have to assume that they planted tomatoes and maybe there's some sort of telltale sign and try to avoid that spot. But your first year is going to be a bit of a hit and miss.
Gamble. Yeah.
Gamble. But my advice is if you do start to see blight, early blight, especially remove the plant. And don't compost it, you have to remove it. Like, you know, get it out of there and put it in a garbage plastic bag to get rid of it, or it's going to spread.
Yeah, I was going to say, right into a black plastic bag. And then if you leave that in the sunshine for about 2 weeks, it will cook and kill pretty much everything in there.
Yep.
And your compost, not all community gardens have this setup, but it's usually recommended that there's 2 compost systems going. So one is going to be for your weed seeds, disease material, things that are only going under like tree shrubs or hedges. And then you're going to have another compost that you can put your leaf litter, your grass clippings, and your vegetables into. And then that can go into your garden. But yeah, your first year, it's going to be very, very rewarding. But there might be a couple of blood, sweat, and tears happening. That's okay though, because what you can do is you can get to know your neighbor in the community garden. I know a lot of gardens are saying if you have an even numbered allotment this year, you're on like even numbered days of the week to go out to the garden. If you have an odd number allotment, then you're out on odd numbered days of the week. So one of my gardens is allotment 83. So I only go on, you know, like day 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, so on and so forth. But you can get to know other gardeners, staying within, you know, a nice 6 feet and 2 meters of each other, and ask their advice. Ask them if they remember what somebody in your allotment had planted last year. What are the most common crops that people will put into their gardens? Is there one that everybody talks about like the great blight of 2018. So yeah, 2018 was actually a really bad year across Ontario for tomato blight. Pretty much everybody lost their crops because it was a cool but a wet summertime. And then every once in a while there'd be this crazy, crazy heat. And it's a fungal pathogen, so that's the perfect environment for it to breed.
Yeah, unfortunately, wet summers are the death of vegetable gardens, believe it or not. So another tip, so when you are watering your tomatoes, water the roots. So water underneath the leaves. Don't water from the top of the plant down, because that is how a lot of diseases spread. You want to water the soil, not the plant. I'm looking for recommendations about growing celery, particularly the species or the variety Tango. Spacing in a square foot garden approach as well. So, oh, I'm guessing you've got some celery going.
Of course I do. I'm a little crazy for vegetables. So these were planted on March 30th. They are looking beautiful. So this isn't Tango. This is one called red celery, and the stems are actually red. I'll post a picture on Instagram after this. In terms of spacing for your square foot garden, although they look really, really small, they're going to get pretty big, and I generally say 4 celery per square foot. For these, so I've put in about 5 or 6 seeds per cell, and I have a 72 cell tray here. I will take 4 of these, put them like in each corner of my square foot, and then I will thin them out. So as the plant grows kind of about this tall here, then I'll start thinning them out, so then I can have little small bits of celery that I can add into soups and stews and stir fries, and then leaving enough that they can really fill out for that July, early August harvest.
Right, so speaking of thinning vegetables out, so you will need to thin things like carrots out because the seeds are so tiny. You're just going to sprinkle that down the row and you'll get so many packed in there. And when I teach gardening families how to garden, inevitably people say, oh, but I want as many carrots as possible. I'm not going to thin. And I say, but you're not going to get as many carrots because you're not thinning. So it's like shoving a whole bunch of kids into a tiny little room and expecting them to grow. They're not going to do it. So you have, if we put them each in their own little room, then they have space. So that's what you need to do with the carrots as well. And yes, I often compare vegetables to children. But yeah, you need to. So Alice and I will have a little discussion about thinning out. So I'm the type of person who just gets in there and I pick them out. But I think, Alison, I don't know if you're that type of person or if you like.
I'm more laissez-faire with my gardening. If it doesn't need to be pulled out, then I don't do it because I'm kind of lazy as well. But like for things like spinach, lettuce, and those leafy greens, I will broadcast in an area. So I'm not going to be counting things out because I'm also impatient. But that also allows me to have a continuous harvest. So I let things grow a little bit taller. For carrots, I will usually mix the carrot seed with sand and then I will drizzle it along a trench. Radishes I'll count out, and beetroot I'll count out. But it does depend on how much space. So for the St. Christopher's Teaching Garden, there's only, I think, 26 raised beds there. They're about 3 by 8 feet. So I can count things out and plant them. But on my herb farm, I have a cedar because I'm looking at growing on 3/4 of an acre, and then we're moving up to 2 acres this summer. So I'm not going to be counting any of that by hand. And things also get a lot more expensive when you're overseeding. So I have to make sure that things really are counted out, because if I have a spot where my spacing is for 100 crops and I overseed with, let's say, 200 seeds, I'm going to lose half of that revenue because I've just kind of wasted a whole bunch of seed. But that's where the square foot method is nice. You can have these suggested, you know, like the 4 celery per square foot, 1 tomato per square foot. 16 carrots per square foot, and you can really conserve if you've got a restricted budget, and then saving seed or trading seed with other people.
Another way some people do thin, though, they get out the scissors and they actually just cut off the tops of the plant. So that's a quick and easy way too. Because sometimes I've gone in there and I've not been as gentle as I should, and I've gone to pick just one or two, and I end up picking 4 or 5 little seedlings come all out at the same time because their roots have all tangled up inside each other. So if you're starting to see that, just get a pair of sharp scissors and just chop off the heads of the ones that needed to be thinned out.
And then you can use the tops for in salads, pretty much whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any other questions for us this week? I'll point out a couple of resources. If you go to our website at haltonfood.ca, and then kind of along the top, there'll be a section called Gardening Resources. That will take you into a page with a whole bunch of drop-down menus and icons. And one of them is going to have companion gardening. So if we go back to the celery question, like there's the question about square foot gardening, but then what other recommendations you might have? Well, looking for a crop that's going to grow well with celery, not bringing in pests, but actually, you know, kind of having a beneficial relationship. So for example, tomatoes love carrots. You can plant the 2 of them within 1 square foot, and they're going to have a mutually beneficial relationship. But if you put squash and tomato together, they're going to have an antagonistic relationship. The squash and tomato both need a lot of nutrients, so they're both going to be competing for the same nutrients in the soil, and they also need a lot of space. So yeah, check out Gardening Resources. There's information about square foot gardening on there, also some companion planting, and honestly, like every week we're looking for more resources and adding more resources to the site, including the different YouTube channel posts that we've had from our other presentations.
Yeah, the one good one to keep together are onions and carrots. The onions are supposed to keep away the carrot sawflies. Is it the sawfly or just the carrot fly? And but you're not supposed to grow onions with beans, so they don't like each other. So just so you can plan these things out when you're doing your own. So what kind of companion plant is good for kale to get rid of aphids?
Oh.
So are you getting aphids? Because I know my kale gets flea beetle, and they leave little tiny pinpricks all over the leaves. But I end up, that's mostly cosmetic. So it ends up getting big enough that it's not an issue anymore. But if it is aphids, then I'm going to pass that to Allison.
Aphids they're a tricky one. If you have aphids, it'll be very difficult to get rid of them. So there's kind of 2 thoughts. You either plant crops that aren't going to attract aphids at all for a couple of seasons. You can have some really stinky plants in your garden, and I see, yeah, Andrea's on the same wavelength as me. So planting marigolds as a perimeter plant, and then planting kale, but with the knowledge that you're going to lose some. So you can have kale planted on, let's say, the south side of your garden, and then kale planted on the north side, which is typically what I do, kind of 2 opposite ends. And one is used as a trap crop. So I let the one section get covered in aphids, and I want them all to go there, whereas I'm protecting the other one using, I just use soap and water generally. If I'm early enough with my scouting, then I can go through and I can just squish as many aphids as possible, because I don't typically plant too many aphids, I don't plant aphids at all. I don't plant too much kale in our free food garden because it's kind of a hit and miss crop in the community. Yes, it's wonderful, it's nutritious, but not a lot of people like to eat it. But yeah, the other thing you can use are floating row covers. So you're going to put those on just after the plants emerge out of the soil, when they get to the first or second true leaf stage. You're going to put your floating row cover over top. What that's going to do is it's going to prevent any insects from going into your crop, but then it's also going to trap those underneath the cloth. So they'll go through a full life cycle underneath the cloth, but because they won't be able to escape and breed, you'll be able to get that population down really low to an almost zero population level. There's always going to be, you know, some good pests and some bad pests in organic gardening, but it's finding that balance. And we're going to talk about kind of more the integrative pest management, more kind of the end of June, when we are starting to see signs of things in the garden.
Yeah, the floating row covers are great. So they keep out a lot of, you want to maybe cover your squash plants as well, because they tend to get attacked by a beautiful red bug that's called the squash borer, but it just will decimate your crop. And that keeps it from laying the eggs on the leaves. They lay the eggs on the underside of the leaves where it's hard to see. And then when the larvae starts to grow, it goes actually in the stem of your squash and eats its way from the inside out. So yeah, it's a nasty little thing. So if you put the floating row cover on top of your crop right up until it needs to be pollinated by the bees. So that's a good way to.
And I think you can pick them up at, I saw them for sale at Rona for a very reasonable price. Rona has a 2-day kind of waiting in order to pick things up from the store. Yeah, all the online kind of growers are sold out. If you are a community garden, then send us an email, because we might be able to put a bulk order together for certain supplies. But if you don't have access to floating row covers, there are some alternatives. The row covers are a very, very fine mesh, and you can get the bio-organic certified ones, or you can get the traditional kind of plastic. But yeah, really, really loose mesh. You know, small enough that things can't get in and out, but the water and the air is still going to infiltrate. You can also use old bed sheets or tablecloths. The really old ones that you're noticing that they're starting to thin out and you wouldn't necessarily put in the guest bedroom. But those will work. Make sure that they're very light in color, either the white, the very light yellow, or the very light blue, because they're going to allow that sunlight to get through. But those ones you'll have to really monitor to make sure that they don't get too heavy, that they start crushing your plants. So you might have to put a hula hoop over the row or your raised bed, and then the cloth can go over top of the hula hoop so it's not weighing the plant down.
So that will also help. Somebody had a question about squirrels, so the row covers will help with that. Squirrels, yeah, they are a nuisance.
There they are. Learn to love the squirrels. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Fencing won't work for long. They'll figure it out. They're quite intelligent little creatures.
But you can create cages.
Yeah, so that it's covered all the way around. Get a dog. If you don't have a dog, sometimes if you can ask a friend, especially right now, since people aren't getting their dogs groomed, they're doing it at home. Say, hey, could you leave some clippings of your dog hair in a little baggie on my porch? And then you can plant that around the garden, because the smell of it will also deter a lot of like mice and squirrels. Not all summer for sure. You'll have to work that scent.
But they will learn. They will learn. And
they will learn, hey, it's not moving, but it'll work for short-term gain. In the short term, and you're just kind of plugging up holes. So I've been, I have a couple of voles at my house, and they're causing mass destruction. So I have been taking part of the dog hair and the cat hair, and I've been stuffing it down the holes they don't like that smell, because that's a predator for them. And I've been spreading chili powder on top of my crops, and I've been spreading coffee grounds. So anything that's kind of very different, strong scent, or a human scent or an animal scent that's going to prey on them, they're going to start to keep away. I've also put out live traps for the mice. So I've been putting a little bit of peanut butter inside, trapping the mice, and then I've got a forest about a block away that I've been dropping them off in there. So I'm doing whatever it takes.
Probably why they're going back to your garden though.
Well, they have to go through a construction site to get here.
Oh,
So
okay.
they're not
Yeah.
coming back.
What I typically do is when I have space is I will actually plant a perimeter of onions around the outside of the raised bed, and then my valuable crop on the inside. Because I'm in an area where we'll see lots of bunny rabbits coming through, and the way they move is they jump and they nibble, they jump and they nibble. Oh, this tastes good. I'm going to keep going in the direction where it tastes good. They hit the onion and it's like, nope, I'm not going to go any further. Unfortunately, that doesn't work for squirrels. Squirrels are masterful and crafty, as well as chipmunks. So at home here, my problem is actually chipmunks. I have some cats and dogs that stay away from, that keep the, yeah, the rodents away. But then we also, because we have a forest, we've got feeders where they can go and get some other food.
Yeah, it's about making something more attractive to them somewhere else rather than making your garden the attraction.
Yeah, so there's a really nice nursery down in Niagara called Grimo, and they have all these nut trees available. You can get black walnut, heartnut, butternut, pecans, all grown in Niagara. So I usually buy like 5 or 6 pounds of them at the beginning of the season, and I create, I guess, caches for the animals. So I like put out the pecans and stuff in the forest over there, whereas my garden is back here, and hopefully that they continue to go that way.
So eventually you will all be coyote lovers because the coyotes will keep everything else down.
Does anybody have any other questions at all? So we're going to be,
is there anything you would like to see in future presentations? So we will talk about the integrative pest management. We can talk about,
yeah, companion planting has been pretty popular. We could probably do that one next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to see? Just put it in the chat box and we will create a presentation around it.
Brilliant. Right. And if you find that, you know, you've gone away and had a nice cup of tea in your garden, and all of a sudden you think of something you'd like to ask us, you can message us on Instagram at halton.food, Twitter at Halton Food, so you'll notice that there's that period missing there, or via Facebook, or you can send us an email at grow@haltonfood.ca, and it'll either be myself, Helen, or Andrea answering any of your questions.
I just wanted to jump in as well and mention that we had set up kind of a recurring meeting to register. We're not going to use that going forward. We found it too cumbersome and too difficult. So going forward, we will be posting a new Zoom link for each of the following week's presentations. So you'll have to look every week for the new Zoom ID and password or the link to join us. So just a heads up for anybody that used that link to register for today, we've decided to change procedures going forward. Hi, Lisa.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all for joining us this week for our Dig Into Gardening. We will be back next week, of course. If you have any questions, you can email us ahead of time. You can just show up to the webinar. So it'll be Wednesdays at 1 p.m. And today at 3 p.m., we're going to be taking a tour of my hives. So I've got some beehives on my property here. That'll happen at 3 o'clock over Instagram. So I'm just going to do about a 15 to 20 minute Instagram live. So we want to celebrate World Bee Day today, May 20th. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. See you next week.